welcome. Hi, I'm Raymond Cheng. You probably read that in the speaker notes. Very excited here to welcome you to Open Source Day, which we're proud to host with Funding the Commons. I'm from an organization called Open Source Observer, which you'll hear about later today, measuring the impact of open source software. But I think what really excites me about today is like seeing this in the room. Like we have folks from traditional free and open source software like Linux and Mozilla. We have thought leaders in the Web3 public goods funding space. We have folks that work on open source in government. We have folks that are investing in open source from the investor ecosystem like A16Z and Pantera. We have such an incredible, diverse set of people in this room that I'm super excited to see what kind of conversations we get out of this. So what kind of started today in particular, this is a day purely focused on funding of open source software. And the reason why this came about was because David and I were talking about Funding the Commons. Funding the Commons has this long history of thinking about how do we change and transform how funding of public goods happens. And naturally, as a consequence of these prior conferences, we talk about open source a lot because it's one of the most prevalent public goods that we think about. And I wanted to come back and actually take this systemic view, bring in different parties from all sorts of different industries and think about this holistically. And when we think about funding, I think we need to start thinking about this as economic policy and an economic problem. Because here, like, these are just some simple stats. I'm sure you guys have seen these things before. You know, there's a recent study from Harvard Business School that showed that the value of open source software is upwards of 8 trillion. You know, there's fuzzy error bars, but it's a big number. I'm sure of it. And, you know, some studies from the European Union have shown that even if we just increase contributions by 10%, we bump the GDP of the European Union by 0.5 percentage point. So there is clear economic value to open source software. And the pervasiveness now is undeniable. 90+% of companies use open source somewhere, and every company uses open source in the majority of their stack somewhere. So recent studies have shown that 70 to 90% of a modern software stack, including all of these Silicon Valley unicorns, are using open source software in their bundle. And what actually gets shipped to production, the majority of it is stuff that they're getting for free. So I want to look at this from a productivity lens. If productivity is growing fast, and that's leading to exponential growth in our economy, just anecdotally for me as a developer, I know this is true. I know that I'm at least 10x more productive today than I was 10 or 20 years ago. And if you factor out my skills and the experience that I've gained from the work that I've done, it's the programming languages, it's the libraries and package dependencies that I have, it's the developer tooling that I use. These are the things that directly make me more productive. And then for the broader economy, it is indirectly the software that we are using. Because if software is eating the world, and 70 to 90% of that is open source software, then by definition, a large major backbone of this productivity transformation in the economy is open source software. So I want us to start thinking about this differently. We're well past the days of open source as hobby developers building stuff in the background. And I think it's important that governments are starting to realize that this is digital public infrastructure. So they are starting to think about things like how do we secure the supply chain and all of that. But that's an important discussion to have, but it's so much more than that. There are things that we can do to systemically change how we support public goods and actually advance economic growth and prosperity for the future. Compared to the value that it brings, free and open source software funding is still nascent, in my opinion. You know, software foundations like Linux and Mozilla, we're on the order now of hundreds of millions of dollars. Money that's coming from government tech funds directly into open source, company organized like FOSS funds and direct money that's going into open source software is on the order of tens of millions of dollars. Crowdsourced donations are growing quickly, like GitHub sponsors and Open Collective, but still on the order of tens of millions of dollars. If you think about the gap between how much we're investing in open source software and how much value we bring, it's huge. And I'd love to see, I think there is still space here to grow and think about what the future systems should look like. Funding is growing. I think we're at a really unique point in time. It's like the systems that we put in place now, the funding flows, the incentives, the programs, the processes that we put in place are gonna have ripple effects for decades and even centuries to come. Think about like the ways that we think about incentives now in the scientific infrastructure and the institutions that exist And yes, we talk about like broken incentives and all sorts of issues in the scientific apparatus, but the way that the NSF and the way that these scientific funding agencies were set up in the early 20th century have huge implications on how we do science into the future. And I think we're at that point now for open source software. These foundations are growing quickly, and crypto foundations are increasingly putting a large amount of money into open source software as well. Just one example, Optimism just last year put in $100 million predominantly into open source software, and they're not the only ones. We estimate about $100 billion sitting in ecosystem treasuries. A lot of it is going to go into open source software. And so how we think about funding allocation, it's not just about growing the pie, it's about how do we invest in open source software in a smart way such that we're making the best effective use of that capital so that we're going towards the future that we want and not the future that we don't want. So what should we expect today? We have like incredible people today. Like this agenda is a dream come true for me. We have experienced grant makers from foundations like Linux and Mozilla. Ryan's here, he's gonna give our keynote. Hero of mine, we're gonna learn about new models of funding, like from Gitcoin and Drips, and Juan Benet from Protocol Labs is gonna talk about network funding. There's all sorts of new experimentation that we're doing. Still early, but we're learning about it and we're experimenting as we go. You're gonna learn about like new models of running businesses. So we're now at a point, because of the network effects of software, we are at a point now where open core isn't the only way to build software that is profitable. We can build businesses entirely open source. And that's really interesting, and it's gonna change how investors think about investing in public goods oriented companies, and you're gonna hear about that from some of the investors today. You're gonna learn about how we measure impact and how that, as a society, we can shape over time, from ecosystems and Andrew, as well as my co-founder, Carl from Open Source Observer. But I'm most excited about the discussions that we're gonna have in the hallway and in the workshops, where we should be collaborating together across industries on how we can most effectively fund the public goods of the future. So that's my spiel. I'm here to get you guys hype. Let's find good ways to grow the pool of funding towards open source software and public goods, and let's figure out how to allocate this money effectively. Thanks.